as we resume the Deccan Conversations today. I'll first begin by introducing Khidki Collective to those of you who may not know who we are. We are a small voluntary collective of scholars interested in the Deccan region. The motivations for our work lie in finding ways to translate and communicate academic insights for wider non-academic audiences. Uh, as part of this effort, we've hosted public conversations as well as curated public writing series in popular publications such as the News Minute and the Wire. This series, the Deccan Conversations, we in this we bring together several early career scholars who are working on the region. We began actually on the 15th of April this year with a talk by Dr. Hima Bindu, who discussed the Telugu periodicals and linguistic networks in the princely state of Hyderabad. Our next talk was by Pramod Mandade, a PhD scholar at IIT Bombay, who's studying the politics of memorialization on the integration of Hyderabad. A third talk was by Namrata Kanchan, a PhD scholar at the University of Texas, Austin, who spoke to us about forging early modern Dakhanese literary canons. Our fourth and the previous last talk was by Dr. Shashi Kiran on Telugu print cultures and modernities of the Madras Presidency. All talks have been or will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, and a short summary of each of these talks is put up on our social media handles. In this regard, we, at this point, seek your consent in recording this talk, since we'll be putting this up on our YouTube channel. Today, in this fifth talk in our series, we have Indivar speaking to us on politics, property, and planning in Hyderabad. Before I introduce Indivar, I'd like to introduce our interlocutor for today. It's Dr. Eric Beverly, who is the Associate Professor of History at the Stony Brook University. He's the author of Hyderabad, British India and the World, Muslim Networks and Minor Sovereignty. His book is The World from Hyderabad, a minor South Asian state under sovereign Muslim rule. This book redefines the nature of state sovereignty in the era of colonialism, and he identifies the close relationship between Muslim rule and political modernity. Dr. Beverly's current book project is a study of the urban history of Hyderabad city from 1910 to the present, and it examines the city's expansion through the lens of urban property, which makes him the perfect interlocutor for Indivar. Indivar is an incoming assistant professor of international studies at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. He recently completed his PhD in anthropology and South Asia studies at the University of Pennsylvania. His research over the past 9 years has engaged with questions of urban governance, housing rights, sanitation infrastructure, right to education, among others. He has published peer-reviewed articles in the EPW, Urban Studies, IJURR, City, the Cambridge Journal of Anthropology, among others. He's very interested in public scholarship and in experimenting with multimodal and accessible formats for sharing research findings. Indivar is also, this is a special talk for us at Khidki Collective because Indivar has also been a long-time member of the Khidki Collective. So thank you, Indivar, for agreeing to share your research with us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Swati, for such a kind introduction. Thank you to Eric for being here as the discussant, and thanks to the Khidki Collective for inviting me. I just want to acknowledge, and I'm sure a lot of us have been thinking about it this week, all of the things that have been happening in India this week with Nu and Gurgaon and the Jaipur Express shootings, and also the ongoing Manipur conflicts. And I'm grateful for a space like Khidki, which is trying to open up questions about, or trying to open up for public discussion, values of pluralism, secularism, and, with a goal to kind of challenge some of these trends that we are seeing, even though it's a small start. So thank you to the Khidki Collective. With that, let me get into my talk. I'm just going to start my timer and share my screen. Yeah. So the title for my talk today is Politics, Property, and Planning in Global Hyderabad. We often talk about, the failures of planning in Indian cities or the challenges of planning in Indian cities, but we don't often talk about the politics of property that we're all implicated in, especially the privileged urban classes, and how that shapes cities at a large scale, although we understand how it works at a small scale. So this talk is kind of an attempt to bridge that gap, to pose some questions and present some descriptions from my fieldwork that'll help us think about what property does to the city as a whole. So in October 2020, Hyderabad was at the epicenter of a cyclone off the Bay of Bengal, which resulted in massive, unprecedented flooding in many parts of the city. In news media, expert commentators pointed out that the issue was not just the result of extreme weather, but also of unplanned growth in the built form of the city. And here I'm not just talking about the magisterial interview with Ravish Kumar that Anant Maringandi gave. I'll come to that later. But as a result, in the throes of the flooding crisis, social media discussions turned to urban planners to account for this situation. But during my fieldwork in Hyderabad, I found that a lack of planning or a failure of planners is not an adequate explanation for unplanned growth and doesn't help us address issues of recurring and intensifying urban crises such as flooding. In fact, it also fundamentally misrecognizes how the technical field of planning operates in India. As a prominent urban planner and frequent consultant to the government in Hyderabad told me in frustration one afternoon in September 2018, he said, planners in Hyderabad are in a purely reactive role. We are only responding to things already happening on the ground. End quote. His frustration stems from the blame of unplanned urbanization always being placed on planners, when really it's other actors altogether who shape and produce urban environments. In Hyderabad, like in most of India's so-called unplanned or unintended cities, we actually need to look at a different governmental agencies altogether to understand this process, not the technical and abstract practices of planners, but the sort of prosaic everyday processes of land administration and property registration, which occur through micro-political negotiations between government and the governed. So I started my fieldwork studying land bureaucracy by visiting various offices of the Revenue Department in urban Hyderabad. The Revenue Department oversees both land and civic administration in the district. I wanted to understand what techniques were employed to record the land ownership per se. And at the outset, I expected to find maps, either new or old, representing the property ownership distribution of districts and sub-districts. But over visits to multiple offices across Hyderabad, I was proven wrong, and I was struck by the routine absence of maps of the city or district. Finally, during a visit to a Tehsildar office in Asif Nagar, I came across a map on the wall of the Tehsildar's cabin. I pointed to the map and asked him, "So do you update new property titles into a map of the district?" The map I was looking at on his wall was printed from Google Maps, with the administrative boundaries of the revenue sub-district of the Tehsil outlined by hand with a marker. The Tehsildar looked up at the map himself and blankly, and after a pause, responded, "Map? No, we don't update any map. There hasn't been a survey of the cadastral record of the city since the 1960s. We still rely on that old survey map." So the Revenue Department's work of maintaining land-based property records and policing encroachments is carried out with reference to an outdated cadastral map, and as I described below, entirely relational property records. In striking contrast then to the planners whose master plans are an abstract representation of space 20 years in the future, the land administrators operate based on a map, which is a representation of property relations 60 years in the past. So planners and administrators work in divergent timescapes of governance. So timescapes of governance is a conceptual framework developed by Laura Baer, which posits that different techniques of reckoning with time and space in the city entail different pathways and techniques and ethics of governance. And I use this framework. So for these bureaucrats, the urban landscape is a dynamic entity that emerges from many disparate ongoing processes on the ground. They are not intentionally oriented to large-scale spatial transformation or urban growth. But they nonetheless, these practices orient urban governance to what I call fait accompli property relations in the city, property relations that have already been settled or that have already occurred out of the control of the government. And this has far-reaching effects on how urban space is produced. The bureaucratic practices I describe are not just technical exercises in this sense, but they are deeply political processes that determine the distribution of urban land and property and the recognition granted to different kinds of claims to property in the city. So historians like Eric Beverly here and Debjani Bhattacharya, among others, have shown that in both colonial and princely Indian cities, there have been iterative efforts to impose order on cities using the technology of property or the frame of property. But these have often resulted in fragmentary and divided property regimes as opposed to meeting the expectations of the property ideology. But despite these persistent difficulties, the colonial ideology of property and desires of a perfectly transparent and conclusive property record influence even contemporary post-colonial governance. They exercise this influence while continuing to remain incomplete and imperfect techniques. But in true post-colonial form, successive governments in Hyderabad have continued to prioritize property as a technology of governance. So I focus on two sets of administrators in this talk, officers of the Revenue Department and the Registration Department, both of whom wrangle with technologies of property to try to govern the city as they encounter it in their offices, not out there or in the field. So in this paper, I'll illustrate this property approach to urbanism by focusing on three practices. Firstly, the mode of record keeping practiced by urban revenue departments. Secondly, the process of registration through which property transactions are recorded. And thirdly, I describe processes of property regularization, which are carried out by the revenue department to realign their imperfect records with the changing realities of property ownership on the ground. Regularization entails what my planner interlocutor above had called reactive work through a process of reconciling record with reality upon payment of a penalty fee, mostly without altering the transgressions at all. The framing of this mode of governance as lack of planning and the dangerous discourse of encroachment has brought us to an impasse in urban studies in the global south. So in this slide, my talk offers new concepts and narratives to renew a critique of the actually existing modes of governance in Hyderabad and much of the world. That brings me to part one. In July 2015, at Nalsar University in Hyderabad, I attended a two-day conference organized by the World Bank. At the time, I was an employee at Hyderabad Urban Lab. The conference was called Unlocking Land for Urban Growth. The conference speakers included urban planners, architects, lawyers, bureaucrats, activists, and academics interested in the field of urban development and urban growth. We, the audience, were listening to a presentation by an urban planner on the Delhi Development Plan and its supposedly effective use of mapping technologies. When a prominent social scientist raised a note of caution and he quipped that, these maps have as much truth value as an expressionist painting. And he added that the spaces represented in these maps as slated for development have already been completely built up, contrary to the representations of the planning document. The comment was met with a moment of awkward silence and then forgotten. The conference espoused a faith in spatial technologies and a desire for a future of planned urban growth, when messy property relations will give way to smooth real estate. But conspicuous by their absence at such conferences are the officers of land administration itself. The revenue department is so named because of its function of collecting revenue from taxes on agrarian land and landed property. But alongside land administration, the contemporary revenue department also implements an enormous range of welfare and development schemes, and they are central to the civic administration of the city as well. Here, I'm concerned with just one crucial function of this department, which is the maintenance of property title records, also known as a cadaster. At the urban revenue offices, I didn't observe any processes or conversations oriented to digitizing or clarifying urban records, let alone thinking of planned urban growth. Nor were revenue officers invested in maps as a means of governmental control or legibility or something like that. In everyday practice, space for these urban revenue officers was neither dynamically mapped in real time through a GIS database, nor was it represented through periodically updated static maps. The city as a whole was not a legible aggregate object that can be acted upon, as envisioned by a master plan, for example. But rather, for these officers, the city is the amalgamation of all of the documents and lists and embodied observations about the property landscape that they collect through their work. This is also revealed by how records are stored in these offices. The records are stored as files and lists. Land records are physically organized in record rooms based on survey numbers of land parcels represented in the old survey map from the 1960s. New land titles mention the survey numbers they fall within, and the title includes a location sketch representing the boundaries and dimensions of the plot of land, along with information about the owners of neighboring plots in a schematic diagram. So I knew that this is what a title document looked like. But during this fieldwork, I realized that the record itself consisted of these individual titles filed in bundles under the relevant survey numbers in hard copy. Thus, not only are the Urban Revenue Department's records entirely in hard copy, they also only have relational spatial coordinates through hand-drawn location sketches. This was striking to me for two reasons. Firstly, at the outset of my fieldwork, I assumed that property title deeds were a tool for the state to translate sort of heterogeneous land claims in the city, complex land claims in the city, into private units to make them more manageable, which would be definitively mapped and recorded. And this is also what the government itself claimed it intended to do through processes of titling. For example, people who are from Telangana will recognize the term Geo 59, which was a major regularization scheme introduced in 2015 and was recently reconducted in 2023 as well. These schemes promise that land titling and in the city will bring clarity about title of land, will bring plan development, but it didn't seem to have, the implementation didn't seem to have followed up on those goals. Secondly, I was befuddled because the contrast of the availability of digitized and detailed land records for rural spaces as opposed to this empty or undigitized catastrophe of the urban spaces. Revenue officers have imbibed an encyclopedic and obsessive knowledge of the classifications of land in rural Telangana and the various kinds of records maintained by rural revenue departments. But I learned that in the practice of the revenue department, the urban land is actually exceptional. Rural space is normative with rich taxonomies of land use and newly digitized property records. Whereas there's no data on urban land ownership in something like the Integrated Land Records Management System, for example. The urban district of Hyderabad and some of its surroundings are completely unmarked in the state database. So the revenue officer's explanation for this divergence between thick rural data and thin urban lists is deceptively simple. They say it's just a result of property subdivision, something that was often repeated to me to explain the complexity of urban governance. So the Secunderabad RDO, for example, explained to me once in January 2020 that, take any survey number in the city. Before 1948, it all belonged to one landlord, say. Since then, it's been broken up, redistributed, sold, etc. Say in the 1960s, at some point, a record was created of new subdivisions within the survey numbers by assigning a slash to those numbers and creating subunits. And outside the official record in everyday practice, even those subunits have been further subdivided with more slashes added through both licit and illicit transfers. And some of these subdivisions have been reconsolidated afterwards into new properties and so on. So though properties don't have a unique identifying number, so it's hard to find a unique identifying number for properties and then to keep up with all of the transformations taking place on the ground. So instead, the revenue department works with relational units of identifying land with reference to things around them as represented in that hand-drawn sketch. So this emptiness of the digitized map for urban land ownership is not a result of an absence of knowledge. My argument is that it's rather a result of a plenitude of knowledge, and specifically thick relational knowledge. And representing this thickness of urban relations would require greater cost, effort, and some technological ingenuity as well. And further, it would need to settle a deeply unsettled relational landscape. So instead of attempting this digitization, the revenue department works with a pragmatic thinness and uncertainty about urban space, and its distribution as property is constitutive of this everyday administration. So as a result, the thick categorical knowledge of rural spaces doesn't exist with regards to urban space. And the categories that do exist are inadequate to keep up with rapid processes of subdivision that characterize urban space and time from the perspective of revenue officers. So I hope that I've showed that in this way, the property lens precludes the land administration from conceptualizing the city as an aggregate object or from generating an updated urban cadastre. But nonetheless, this sort of incomplete and always in the making relational cadastre of the city is the baseline for more than just land administration in the city. It affects all practices of urban development, including planning. But before I get to those points, let me come to the next part of my presentation on registration and the problem of real time. So although the revenue department is the ultimate arbiter of land records, the registration department also prominently deals with land property transactions. It describes itself as a royal record keeper through which the public has access to histories of transactions based on chains of documentation. So the registration department engages in the continual work of commensurating paper record and ground reality by examining documented claims alongside facts on the ground, such as duration of possession and extent of construction. I conducted fieldwork at a registration office at Erragadda, which constantly bustled and teemed with activity. It opens every day at 9 in the morning, but business truly begins when the officer known as the sub-registrar takes their seat in the office. Across the street from the office, which is the pictures you're seeing on the screen, this is the street. There are several shop fronts belonging to private brokers who call themselves registration consultants. So as Sangeeta Banerjee has demonstrated in her work on Mumbai, the work of post-colonial bureaucracy is always mirrored and complemented by an organized field of brokers and fixers. And they now call themselves consultants because most government offices, if you visit them, have signs on the wall saying no brokers allowed. So they just call themselves consultants now. But it was rare. And if you go into the office, it was rare to see an ordinary person walk in without a broker or consultant. In fact, even as an ethnographer, I found it essential to make trips with a broker to make sense of the whole process. I shadowed a broker named Rahul as he navigated some of his work with clients seeking property registration. And I found that the flow of events at first has a puzzling effect. There are no signs directing the flow of the process, but somehow all the brokers and their clients are reliably following the same chain of actions. Unless the person comes alone. The people who come alone to the office are just conspicuous. You'll notice them immediately because they stand at the door, squinting around, completely perplexed. And almost by design, they're forced to exit in desperation. But as soon as they step out, they see these shop fronts in the street and promising them registration consultancy. So let me explain a little bit how the registration process works, because that's important for what I'm trying to explain. So let's take an example of Rahul's interaction with two middle-class individuals, Shastri, who bought property from Rao. Shastri and Rao have a sale read prepared by Rahul, who drafted it based on a template that he keeps using for every transaction, to which he's just added the exact details of the property being transacted and the amount of the transaction between them. Alongside drafting the sale deed, Rahul will ensure that Rao and Shastri have all the necessary link documents. And this is the most important thing. The link documents prove that Rao does in fact have the right to sell the property, that he himself acquired it legally through registration. So link documents prove that there is a chain of registered transactions, and hence they validate Rao's claim to the property. Rao provides a stack of documents, most importantly, a sale deed attested by the registration department, which proves that he himself had purchased it legitimately in the past, and maybe other prior registered sale deeds just to back it up. Link documents rarely, however, include a property title deed, which is the document provided by the revenue department. Instead, all the documentation and validation mostly takes place through registration department documents and with reference to registered sale deeds. So let's return to the example. On one busy weekday morning, Rahul and Shastri visited the sub-registrar. Rao wasn't present himself, but was available on call and would add his signature remotely using some new technology. The link documents for the transaction were checked by a sub-official with whom Rahul made constant small talk during the process. And then they finally went up to the sub-registrar, who is the main authority. So if the sub-registrar has a doubt about any of the link documents, they can check the records to verify the information. In this case of Rao and Shastri, the sub-registrar very briefly went back into the record room through a curtain, and then he returned to complete the process. He didn't find any issues. The link documents from Shastri and Rao were clear and corroborated by the registration department. But in general, the registration department's approach to property claims is fundamentally pragmatic, and it incorporates a variety of evidence with the highest value placed on these link documents registered by the department itself. But if there's any missing information, one sub-registrar told me the officers use their best judgment. In other cases, if the judgment is hard to make, an official from the registration department will be sent to conduct field work and verify that the seller has rightful possession of the property in question. So one day I asked Rahul, what if none of these processes yield a clear judgment? He whispered in response, well, there's always money, but let's not talk about that. So while I rarely had the opportunity to talk to a sub-registrar for a meaningful length. They were always swamped with registration processes. But next door, there was the office of a district registrar, which was less frequented and afforded some more time with the officer. So one time as I was pressing this registrar about the imperfect land record and messy land records in the city, he interpreted my comments as an accusation that the blame for land irregularity lies with the registration department alone. So in defense of his department, he said something very striking. He said, the sub-registrar can only proceed based on information he has. We need the evidence to make the correct judgment. And then after a pause, he added, but actually in our line of work, there is no evidence. There are only claims. After all, we do not have real-time data. So I was really struck by him saying that there's no evidence in the work of property registration. There are only claims. This pragmatic and discretionary approach of the registration offices has led to a folk interpretation of property as always flexible and manipulable. And this actually animates public skepticism about any transactions being ratified by them. This, along with the registration department status as the royal record keeper, has meant that the blame for imperfect land records is often placed on them. The registration department, however, defends itself by saying it uses its own records to the best of its ability to ascertain and assent to land property transactions happening on any given day. But it doesn't have real-time data. So the registrar also told me one day, we can only deal with what comes to our desktops. We are a desktop department. So unless we know about changes in the record from other departments, how can we take it into account in our own work? But with these words, the registrar also illuminated for me a crucial dimension of the work he and his co-officers do that we don't often think about. They're not just drafting and documenting property transactions, but they're fundamentally adjudicating which claims to land can be included in the government's record of properties, while also plainly acknowledging that many of the urban property claims never even come to the government's offices. And sometimes the ones that do come to them are false claims, which they're not able to discern in the moment of negotiation. So the work of registrars sometimes creates formally licit private claims on lands protected and prohibited for transfer by the Revenue Department, or lands claimed by other private owners. These processes of registration occur nonetheless through the best available knowledge of the registrars and their surveyors. And they are carried out with the support of brokers like Rahul, who know how to mobilize the right documents, connections, rhetorical strategies, and even bribes to facilitate claims both small and large if clients are able to pay the price. While the registration department is attesting to property transactions in real time, they're operating with data that is anything but real time. They move forward regardless by triangulating and drafting an uncertain reality, thinking with Tom Cohen's work, presented by the claims documented in fuzzy documents, thinking with Sushmita Pati. In this light, there's a broad consensus among not only ordinary people, but even government officers that there are many irregular land holdings and land ownership disputes across Hyderabad as a result of this system. And this has created a sense of the urban landscape as a degenerating property map, and one that always exceeds the recording capacity of the bureaucracy, which further creates a mood of suspicion and skepticism, animating powerful narratives of the city being rife with corruption plots, as a new book by Malini Ranganathan, David Pike, and Sapna Doshi has called them. That especially because irregularities, whether done in bad faith or by accident, can be resolved through routine processes of government regularization. This moral narrative of corruption plots and a degenerating city gains even more traction. And that brings me to my next section on regularization in a global city. So while the registration department records and ratifies transactions through the process I described above, the responsibility to maintain conclusive property records per se lies with the Revenue Department, landed property, and their records are kept in the form of land title deeds, not registered sale deeds. The creation of a title deed after the transaction of land depends on a process known as mutating title, which records the transfer of property from one party to another. But in everyday practice, most urban transactions rely only on the registration department and do not bother with mutating title and getting a title deed from the revenue department. The sort of onerous and time-consuming process of mutating title is widely perceived as lacking utility in the context of small parcels of urban land in the city, which might even be transferred in the short or medium term. So the documentary trace for ownership of a small piece of urban land is often just a chain of of registered sale deeds, often with no clear connection to a title in the revenue records. So let's return to the evocative statement of the registrar that there's no evidence, there are only claims. And these are not broad collective claims, but granular individual claims that must be documented. Governance becomes a matter of intimate and arbitrary engagement with individual property owners. In response to the widespread land irregularities in the city, most notably the presence of large numbers of middle-income housing colonies on government land, in 2015, the Revenue Department initiated a land regularization scheme to clean up the land records and bring transgressions in line with the cadastre. The opportunity to regularize land holding for non-poor households was provided at if those households were able to pay a certain percentage of the current value of the land that they were irregularly holding. But if they paid that, they could get a clear property title to this land. And in Geo 59, there was no upper limit on how much land could be regularized, which means that someone possessing a large tract of government land could regularize it in their name if they were willing to pay the full price for the land. So this obviously generated a heated debate. Merely 2 days after the announcement of regularization scheme, Telugu TV news channels started hosting debates about this question. In a series of roundtable discussions on NTV, for example, a mix of civil society representatives and political spokespersons debated the merits of the scheme. The political spokesperson representing TRS in Congress were unanimous in supporting regularization. They didn't see any alternative or better course of action. The state of land irregularity in the city was too complex to address any other way than reconciling the records with the existing city. But the civil society representatives had a different perspective. They saw the scheme as a massive collusion between all the political parties, and especially by members of the ruling party, to encroach and grab lands. They were furious that the government order doesn't place any upper limit. And one speaker said, this scheme is basically telling us, stop wasting your time making TV appearances and talking about issues. Go grab some land. You can make it your own. You just need some money. So this was the attitude that the civil society spokespersons had. Of course, the other issue with regularization is that the city is a constantly changing set of relations. So every act of regularization is merely the baseline for future irregularities. But nonetheless, regularization is a gold standard of land policy in cities like Hyderabad. Routine regularization makes regulation a process of reconciling and reinscribing activity that does not meet regulatory standards. And meanwhile, Hyderabadis of all stripes are filled with both promise and anxiety when it comes to this property landscape. The one thing that you will find in common across Hyderabad, across tea shops and slum settlements, small talk on public transport, parlor conversations of the elite, is gossip about property prices, new neighborhoods worth investing in, new developments, new clients, new brokers, etc. After all, Hyderabad, despite all the irregularities, is an internationally favored destination for real estate development. But the land situation means that a certain unreliability defines the experience of people. And there's tremendous anxiety about the status of property. And even renowned developers are not seen as safe from land irregularity. And over time, regularization has become a structural inevitability in Hyderabad. So much so that the incentive for small and medium-sized developers to adhere to regulation at the planning stage is considered more expensive than the process of regularizing afterwards. So I argue that when regularization becomes the primary mode of regulation, urban governance becomes an exercise of reconciling record and reality, an exercise of what I call fait accompli regulation. And this brings me to my concluding remarks. Fait accompli regulation is a paradoxical situation where regulation is less about achieving or planning for any particular kind of macro goal for what the city should look like, and more about reasserting the state as the final authority in a process which was actually out of its control. That's basically what all of these departments are up to. The landscape, and so the government operates with a recognition of fundamental multiplicity of property claims in the city, as I showed above. And at some level, this recognition has had spillover benefits for disadvantaged groups who can make claims on the social value of land in the city under certain conditions. This has enabled practices of land invasion and politically strategized squatting with the promise of regularization. However, much more so than benefiting the disadvantaged, it has benefited provincial capital and its mode of land speculation that is not based on smooth and efficient markets, but one embedded in caste power and knowing the right way to manipulate documents and bureaucratic offices. In response, bureaucrats generate a necessarily patchy apparatus of regulation meant to deal with the fait accompli relations in the city, and the quagmire of property relations generates powerful moral narratives about distribution of land in the city. So revenue officers recognize themselves as an actor in this network of fait accompli practices, and they themselves are deeply concerned with the question of reforming the land administration. For example, a series of articles in the monthly Telugu magazine called Telangana Revenue, printed in the name of the Telangana Tehsildars Association, argues that the failure to reform revenue department practices is a result of vested interests who benefit from the status quo of the property landscape of the city. in which a range of interests, international investors, local capitalists, middle classes, and sometimes even the poor, get accommodated in a sort of jugaad system without resolving contradictions between the different classes. So revenue officers themselves participate in a form of regulation that is always on the back foot and reactive, but is nonetheless enacting governance by providing documentary traces for these fait accompli property relations. While administrators mediate landscapes of accumulation and speculation through the processes I described above, planners are also hemmed into these administrative practices of fait accompli regulation. As my planner interlocutor complained above, they also perceive themselves as merely reacting. In aggregate, over time and space, these this practice of fait accompli regulation argue has resulted in hillsides becoming slums, lakes becoming shopping malls, or villages becoming a financial district, all of which, depending on your perspective, might be called encroachments. Although exercised through this granular negotiation, these processes of fait accompli regulation are nonetheless embedded in larger processes that occasionally erupt out of the background through occurrences like floods, landslides, and disappearance of water bodies. So this brings me back to that interview with Ravish Kumar that Dr. Anant Maringanti gave, where he gives a really detailed analysis of the situation in Hyderabad, which I'll summarize much more briefly here. Oh, sorry. So the booming emergence of the real estate landscape over the past 30 years has resulted in disruptions to a centuries-old human-made network of lakes and canals. The real estate development has also decimated 2.5 billion-year-old hills and rocks for infrastructure development, and this has resulted in the destruction of ecological commons through relentless construction. Further processes of land speculation have increasingly pushed residential areas for low-income groups into low-lying and flood-prone areas, especially in the topography of the city. In aggregate, the everyday production of urban space results in real estate development in floodplains, in the path of streams, and on the unstable ground of sliced granite rock and hillocks. But all of these ecological and geological descriptors are ineffectual categories submerged under the property epistemology of urban governance, the property framing of urban governance. As a result, complex urban economies and ecologies are reduced into property records, and property becomes the common sense rendering of space, time, and social relations in the city. So that brings us back to that scene of the floods in 2020. Even as Hyderabad was drowning in a deluge of unseasonal rains, Telangana government was aggressively promoting a layout regularization scheme that it enacted across individually or cooperatively held private properties. This is the so-called reactive work that is the bulk of planning in Hyderabad. Most planners are involved in layout regularization. The property epistemology of the 21st century city means that even an extraordinary weather event and its attendant catastrophe fails to push governmental and public discourse beyond the micropolitics of property. So perhaps what we need is to imagine new relations, to redefine and rethink the relational makeup of the city through new and other lenses, and stop mistaking the obsolete cadastral map or the fanciful master plan as a mirror of the urban landscape, and instead think of new ways to think about the relationships between people, lands, and environments. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you so much. This is an image of a mural at the Ministry of Urban Development in Hyderabad in Red Hills, which I found really striking. And these are some organizations that have supported and funded my work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Indivar. Over to you, Eric.
Yes, thank you so much. I wanted to begin by saying thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks to Khidki for putting this together, and Indivar for inviting me on board as the moderator discussant. Of course, my own current work is about the history, trying to write an urban history of Hyderabad through the lens of property. So there's a lot of connections, and it's really a great honor and pleasure to be able to engage with your work in this public forum with so many people here. that previously I'd had a chance to engage with one-on-one or in written form, etc. So this is really a great pleasure. And it's also a great pleasure to be part of this larger discussion at Khidki, to think about in the context of elite dominance and majoritarian power and neoliberal capitalism, that is currently, as well as kind of environmental destruction that is currently reshaping lives of most people within South Asia, different alternatives to these types of, fait accompli forms of governance, which there seems to be no way around. So I think that I really welcome the opportunity to be part of this discussion, and I'm happy to see so many people here for it. What I'll do today, I will try to very briefly kind of reflect on some of what I think this paper contributes. And I have three different kind of categories of question that I'll ask. And what I'll do to try to make this more of a kind of Q&A discussion is take them one at a time and let Indivar have some feedback. Maybe others can chime in as well, on chat or in person. And I think there also will be some time for sort of questions from people in the audience as well. I think that's definitely something we want to facilitate as well to make this a wider conversation. So my overall sense of the paper is that it really does a fabulous job of looking at the way micro processes of bureaucratic urbanism, as Indivar describes them, mediate between what we might call differently configured regimes of property, or ones that are kind of located in different timescapes, have origins from different moments, or think about governance in relationship to different time scales within the city of Hyderabad. And this would include a kind of expansive urban area, and perhaps be sort of expandable to talk about regions around Hyderabad, or maybe other regions as well, which is something I want to get into. Indivar outlines how a larger order of what we might call untransparent, fait accompli regulatory structures make irregularity a constant thread that facilitates negotiations and flexibility, but one which tends to favor elites or other connected people and makes planning in the ideal sense impossible. And thus, the type of urbanism that we see in Hyderabad is one which his informants described as reactive and not future-oriented. And I want to get a little bit more into thinking about the kinds of futures that this picture helps us think about, how ways that we might think outside of this. The three kind of categories of questions. The first one is about thinking about Hyderabad and the Deccan, for that matter, in comparative context, and how we might use concepts to try to think in this direction. I also have other questions about larger historical processes and the city and its futures. So the first is this question of the comparative framework. And, in general terms, how comparable is Hyderabad with other places? How is it Deccan-y? And if it is Deccan-y, what constitutes Deccan-y urbanism as opposed to South Asian urbanism in general, or global South urbanism, etc.? And I think these are really important questions because, for anyone who is an academic or involved in policy discussions, so much conversation about the histories, planning, and life in cities and urban spaces works from a basic assumption that there are kind of these large, generic, abstract types. I think that was visible in the conference that Indivar talked about. The particularities of place just get boiled down into this large kind of programmatic scheme, which can be applied to virtually at least every global South city, and perhaps every city in the world. And I want to kind of depart from something Indivar mentioned to me when we were talking before this. He said, well, I think Hyderabad is a very peculiar kind of city. And I want to get a little bit at specifically what is peculiar about Hyderabad and how do we situate this? Is there a larger kind of typology that we might call Deccan-y urbanism? Where we might talk about Hyderabad together with places like Bangalore, Pune, perhaps also places like Mysore, or even Aurangabad, Nanded, etc. A lot of other kind of urban areas that go from massive to not considerably smaller in size. Or are we actually talking about something that is a feature of India, South Asia, the global South, or for that matter, worldwide. Many of the processes that Indivar describes here are certainly familiar from Delhi to Dhaka, but also from Jakarta to Lagos, and for that matter, from Moscow to Miami. And in fact, this kind of planned construction of things that are irregular and can get regularized is a constant feature of urban development in places like Miami, for example, which I know very well because that's my native place. So I just wanted to sort of think about how do we actually talk about the specificity and the relationship of a place like Hyderabad to these different kinds of scales. And we might, in thinking about this, talk about the sort of what is at stake, what actually are the effects and the directions that they push in of different forms of bureaucracy, planning, informality or irregularity, or whatever the term is for this particular mode of urban practice, regularization or rationalization. These are schemes that happen in virtually all kinds of places. Or how the earlier moments of things like land reform, development, social or public housing, entitlements to different segments of the population, and what kind of political forces or urbanist visions shape these processes. And, we could talk about the idea of the smoothing out of the city for integration into global capitalist markets of accumulation, the smoothing out of property, or visions of creating the city as a space for realizing social justice and how that actually relates to a kind of transparent form of property. And one thing that Indivar mentions in the paper, and this is actually a direct quote, the government operates with a recognition of the fundamental multiplicity of property claims in the city. So is this actually something peculiar to Hyderabad? Generalizable about all cities in a particular context? And what is this sort of based and anchored in? Is this a kind of global process? Is this something that is in some way historical? And I think thinking about this, it might be useful also to talk about some of the way that concepts are used, because these analytical concepts, of course, are how we reconnect the specific to more general scales of comparison. So what actually is the difference between the informal or unintended city and irregularity, which is the kind of vernacular term that gets used in Hyderabadi discussions of urbanism, the regularization of the irregular? One scholar, for example, Ananya Roy, who I know many of us are familiar with, has talked about how informality is not just a kind of practice on the ground, but actually becomes a vision of how planning is done in a context of deregulation, post-liberalization, urban politics. So I was wondering if this is a kind of useful thing, if this kind of internal concept actually connects to these ones that are not necessarily germane in Hyderabad. And yeah, I guess also another thing to think about are things like vernacular concepts that we have for South Asia and how these might be useful in Hyderabad. Do title, ownership, and property mean different things in Hyderabad vis-a-vis other places? I'm thinking, for example, about this notion of the inalienable or untransferable title. To what kind of right to the city does that actually convey? Or the types of concepts for talking about belonging in the city that have been developed in other scholarship on South Asia, such as time pass or the Pakka Kacha distinction. So yeah, that's sort of my first kind of group of questions about the comparative frame and how we use concepts to bridge between. So I'm keen to hear what Indivar has to say about this topic.
Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you to everyone who's here. I'll go over some of your questions. They've given me a lot to think about, and I do have certain things I think about in relation to all of these topics. So firstly, this question about comparison and what kind of conceptual purchase does this case study of Hyderabad give us? And I think there's many ways in which to think about this. The framing of Deccani urbanism, for example, is really interesting. And, I think especially in a historical frame, there would be very interesting comparisons to draw between the different Deccan cities that you mentioned. In the contemporary context, what I'm working with in terms of comparison is less of like peculiarities of place and bureaucratic cultures, and how more about traveling technologies of property, which, in the contemporary context, the sort of tools available to the revenue department in Hyderabad are not that different from tools available to other land administrations in other Indian cities or other post-colonial cities, or even, as you mentioned, cities in general. So then how do they use it? And there maybe the question of bureaucratic culture comes up. But so again, like there's so many different ways in which we can answer this question about comparison or find useful examples. But the one thing I focus on is regularization. I think, if we're thinking about, what does Hyderabad allow us to think about? Hyderabad has a really intense economy of regularization. I think anyone here who's familiar with the city knows and is constantly hearing about land regularization, layout regularization, building penalization. Something or the other is always getting regularized. And I think that there is so one direction I kind of want to push this in is to say that, what if we think of regularization as actually the normal mode of regulation anywhere, right? Like that regulation in the way we imagine it, the sort of ideal type of regulation is an ideal type, is an aspiration. But actually, if we look at the actually existing modes of governance, we notice more practices of regularization, and that gives us a different understanding of how the world takes shape in this process of governance. So I hope that so that's just one example of a concept that I think can be picked up from here, as opposed to thinking of this Western idea of regulation or planning as the standard that regularization is failing in comparison to. If we actually notice regularization occurring everywhere and think about Hyderabad as a case to think about that as a mode of governance. So that's one answer to the comparison question, and there could be many others. I also love the point that you made about how regularization and rationalization is actually taking place, not just in the global south, but in general. Like even studies of planning in Denmark or other places like this have found that rationalization is actually the mode that it takes, as opposed to this idea of shaping space in the future. But what happens in especially the global south context is that the bureaucracy ends up having to mediate competing interests, right? And I think that's why the bureaucracy is so interesting, is because it gives us a lens into how processes are taking place in ways that try to mediate entangled and competing interests. So elites, international investors, political elites, the poor, all of them are kind of implicated and involved in this property landscape. And then how the bureaucracy doesn't enact a plain sort of deregulation that, for example, something like Planet of Slums or something like that imagines, where then it's just a decimation of any kind of social value of land. But instead they are negotiating and creating different kind of graded landscapes in the city, some of which become available to smooth real estate accumulation, some of which become available for slums, some of which become available for political performative spectacles of various kinds. So I think that's something I find really interesting about the work that this idea of regularization is doing, and how the bureaucracy is operating it. And in that sense, the government does recognize the fundamental multiplicity, I think, of the city. And I think that there's something to be gained from thinking closely with how this bureaucratic mediation is taking place, which will reveal more about how the city operates, rather than a frame of a lack of planning or something like that. And then finally, when it comes to different meanings of title ownership and property, I think that I haven't put my finger on it, and I don't want to stretch the sort of generalizability of what I found, but there is, as I said, something peculiar about Hyderabad. There's something about how property is talked about. There's something about how property animates public culture in the city that I find is really striking. And so, one of these, one of the motivations behind this paper was responding to what I perceived as a powerful moral narrative about the city as property, right? So the fact that these bureaucrats would, in other contexts, would talk to me about how the city is degenerating, about how families are breaking apart. There's a lot of property conflict because of modernity. And that's something I didn't go into here in this talk, but it does create this sort of structure of feeling with and a mood for urbanism, which we don't normally perceive, which is why I find it striking that for the revenue officers, the rural is the norm and not the urban. And they're comparing the urban always to the rural, and the urban is a failed project in relation to the rural taxonomies and rural classification. And I think something of that transfers even to a moral narrative about the city and the village, or it's a recursive sort of loop. But yeah, so these were some of my thoughts in relation to your questions. Thank you so much, and I'd love to hear more and think more with all of these questions.
Yeah, no, thanks. This is really wonderful and I think very thought-provoking. And I think this idea of kind of regularization as a framework for thinking about cities in general, as well as the particular ways that it's instantiated in Hyderabad, is really useful. And it actually makes me think of something that is, I guess, a very different kind of and scale and type of regularization that you mentioned a little bit in the paper and you mentioned here, and which, of course, many people I think in our audience will have thought in great detail about also, that in a place like Hyderabad, one of the forms of regularization that we see happening to create a sort of smooth and frictionless market of property as transferable and usable and developable commodity is the ecological leveling and smoothing, right? Drying out of water or swamp areas, leveling of hills. And this also sort of fits into kind of larger historical dynamics where you have distinction between kind of agrarian land and wasteland, which I think also become sort of idioms for urban land claims and development and assertion of property that facilitate different kinds of degrees of entry. And, I think this is actually, if we are going to talk about something like Deccan urbanism, which I want to kind of push on a little bit more in a moment, or even the particularities of Hyderabad, I do think that this is actually something relevant because we are talking about a particular ecological configuration that largely defines the Deccan, a sort of hilly, rocky upland, sort of lake or tank or pool shaped region, which also, I think, also very, very distinct from places like the kind of major colonial cities. Delhi is something of a sort of anomaly here, but I think the Deccan cities are also places where there is not really a hard ecological boundary to expansion in the form of big mountains or ocean or bay. Like the Deccan cities are ones in which it's sort of infinitely expandable in all directions. That might be an explanation to why we've seen the kinds of development in places like Hyderabad, Bangalore, and Pune to degrees that we haven't seen, I think, in a lot of other South Asian and, for that matter, global cities. So the next thing I wanted to ask about actually is something that I think might also be a useful clue for thinking about Deccan urbanism or Hyderabadi urbanism in its particularity and how property gets shaped within that lens. And, this also connects to my own particular interest, but I'm sure it's something that you and many others here have thought a lot about. How do we actually talk about the way that longer term historical processes and land regimes and social and political dynamics have have shaped places like Hyderabad. And there's one, I think you actually didn't talk about this in the presentation, but at some point you talk about the distinction between the nitty-gritties of bureaucratic urbanism and the ongoing push to smoothen real estate in cities of the global south and make them arenas of accumulation. So I wanted to actually ask you to think a little bit and talk about the historical stakes, recent and long term, behind these particular nitty-gritties of bureaucratic urbanism in Hyderabad, as well as the sort of larger way that real estate procedures have to grapple with and inherit from older land regimes. And you talk at other points about how historical records are critical in sort of linking together and mobilizing claims of various kinds. So I just wanted to ask you to maybe get into some of this nitty-gritty of the urbanism and talk about how we see traces of the particularity of Hyderabad's history and present there. What idioms from the past do paper documents or logics transfer into the present? And I guess we could also say, what do these do and for whom? And I wonder also, is there some clue to be found in the claim of the registration department to be the royal record keeper, right? This does seem to potentially refer to the sort of dynastic, monarchical, so-called princely dynamic in Hyderabad previously. But of course, and I think that we do see the particular kinds of patrimonial networks that shaped the historical distribution of property and rights within Hyderabad before 1948, tracing out in the post-1947, 1948 period. And, one could say the same in perhaps less violent and problematized ways in places like Bangalore and Mysore, where there's a kind of continuity of elite status and claim on the part of sort of erstwhile princely elites. So I don't want to weight this too much towards the sort of princely state side of the history, but I guess basically what I wanted to think about is how longer historical processes, maybe a few decades or even centuries, actually shape these nitty-gritties of bureaucratic urbanism that you talk about.
Yeah, thank you so much. Those are great. So for the first. Firstly, I think this paper and this kind of these questions that I'm asking are opening up a new research project for me about how urban ecology relates to this property framing of the city. And I say in the talk somewhere that these ecological relations are submerged in the property framing. And so the work I want to do is to explain what that process of submerging has been and how it's happened. And in terms of the particularities of Hyderabad's history and how it influences the present and this bureaucratic urbanism that I'm describing, I think there's again like many ways in which we can think about this. So one is the materiality of the landscape itself. So if right now you look at the background of Anand's Zoom, you'll see this map of slums. And at HUL we've actually mapped out like how it sits in the topography of the city, and you can see that this sort of network of water bodies actually shape processes of settlement in the city, right? And there have been different moments of how these wetlands have been valued or not valued, and why poor people end up occupying these spaces. So that's just one example of the materiality of the city that has been shaped by categories of land, but also the materiality of land itself. And one of the one argument that might be made is that sort of post-colonial or post-1948 Hyderabad governance has not really taken seriously the topography of the city and this gradient of the city. The property cadastre is a flat map. It's not, it doesn't show these gradients or take into account these values. But then the bureaucracy does have categories about wetlands, about green spaces, about, Shikam land, for example, is like within the lake bed and so on. And these do end up becoming the access for some contestation and negotiation about, who gets to be where. But I think there has been in the last 30 years a lot of flexibility in reclassifying these lands and rethinking them. There are a few exceptions to this, but so while bureaucrats are aware of these categories, but my argument would be that they are as bureaucratic categories, the lake land, for example, as opposed to taking seriously the materiality of the lake. But there are obviously many particularities to how the city has taken shape in this global real estate boom moment. As we know, global real estate isn't showing up simply everywhere in Hyderabad, right? It's not happening on First Lancer Road. It's not happening in Kishanbagh, right? It's happening in specific areas. And again, that has to do with certain kinds of histories of the landscape, but also certain kinds of bureaucratic maneuvers that were possible in the more expansive space of the northwest of the city, as opposed to within the core city itself. But again, the bureaucracy is able to wrangle things in many different ways. So what I find really useful about Debjani's framing of technology or property, for example, is that the property is not simply a category in that sense. It's not just something is either property or non-property, but instead it's these bureaucratic processes of making land and water into property and what that does. And then you get this really uneven landscape. And today's landscape is obviously a product of this really complex history of Hyderabad's particularity, which you've shown really brilliantly. And so yeah, there's more to think with you. I think this is a project I want to do further. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. I think that this technology of properties thing is a useful framework as well. And one of the, I think, things that Hyderabad and its history shows us is that actually the endpoint of property takes many, many different forms. And I think that kind of inalienable land is one of them, as well as any number of different forms of entitlements or kind of land grant tenures and things like this, which might have very different ways of converting into private property in the kind of liberal capitalist sense. Okay, so I want to open this up to some audience questions, but before that, I want to ask one last question, which you can answer briefly, or maybe it serves as a frame for a lot of us to think about. And one of the things you talked about, interestingly, in the paper is how, on the one hand, the city as such, or even the urban, is not really a kind of perceptible conceptual object amongst your informers, right? The city as an aggregate, as a kind of large category for thinking about ways to do things politically, is not actually a thing. On the other hand, the city, in effect, is entirely constructed by property. You say at some point the exclusive rendering of social relations as property. You describe at some point the exclusive rendering of social relations as property relations. So I wanted to think a little bit about how planning as such is actually stymied by this, as you kind of demonstrate, and talk about the, what this actually means, what we get diverted from, and what are the other different possible futures. If social relations are in fact rendered as property relations, what are the ways that we actually see this? And what other possible futures and ways of engaging the city does this foreclose? If social relations are rendered as property relations, and property is this domain of negotiation and arbitrage within this kind of space of fluidity and flexibility and uncertainty and indeterminacy, what possibilities are there that might come out of this? And I guess, one really extreme example that sort of comes to mind is something like the kind of 2004 Maoist list of grabbed lands that should be returned to the poor or the public or the people in the form of a land bank or direct transfer from the state. And this is, as maybe you're familiar, many of the current kind of capitalist and educational institutions of contemporary Hyderabad are on this list. And if we think about property as being this fluid sort of domain, how does this help us actually think about different ways to engage with the scenario where property is in fact the defining element of what the urban is, even in the absence of a larger conceptualization?
Thank you so much, Eric. Yeah, I do want to think about like that framing of, how property shapes the city and how actually it prevents administrators from thinking of the city as a whole. But maybe I'll try to connect that to a couple of questions that have come up in the chat, which also relate to, some of these questions. So I see a question from Anisha. Hi, Anisha. I'm interested in the various consultants, brokers, and middlemen type figures you come across in your research and how you see their roles in the everyday routine microprocesses. And if they're shaping larger processes of perhaps capitalist accumulation and caste exploitation in Hyderabad. In one sense, I'm thinking of scholarship like Dua and Haxby, who discuss brokers who can delay or interrupt capital. But also in another sense, I'm thinking about how brokers come from various caste class backgrounds and if they can shape the claims too. Oh no, this is very clear. Thank you, Anisha. That's a great question, and that is one of the things that was animating this for me. So also connecting it to Eric's question about how there's a failure to grasp the city as a whole, and I think that not a failure, but like it's precluded, it's forestalled. We're not able to think about the city as a whole because everything becomes these concessions and micro negotiations, and the work of brokers is central. And one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is, what is the social positionality of these bureaucrats who are, circulating stereotypes about the moral degradation of the city, and it does have it seems to resonate with a sort of view of the city as a place where caste is disintegrating, where family is disintegrating, and so on. And so there is that at a very high level, but whether the brokers themselves are doing this is a more complex question, because the brokers are I think it's a very nitty-gritty process, as I've been saying a lot, and there it can go in many different directions. So there are brokers helping large groups of let's say like a Dalit Basti getting rights in the city, but then there are also brokers who are helping massive sort of political elites or capitalist elites to grab land in the city. So it's going in all these different directions. But I think that in some, I think that there is a way in which this uh, favors capitalist accumulation and by extension caste exploitation. And it happens in this way because even for the poor, property becomes the platform for claiming rights in the city. So, in my sort of more fleshed out dissertation work about slums and property, I show that there's this huge investment in the politics of property. And while the investment in politics of property and mobilization through the politics of property has given certain kinds of entitlements to people living in slums, I think the larger story is that it fits them into a landscape that's actually not serving them in any way at all, right? So that's just one sort of answer to your question, but I will think more about this. And I'm familiar with Haxby's work. I'll look into Dua as well. And there's a lot to think about there. Then there's the question from, sorry, did someone say something? No. There's a question from Carol. Hi, Carol. Thank you so much for being here. And, I've learned so much from your work on this as well. Carol asks, on the question of the place of property in urban public culture, I want to flag the apparent boom in small-scale rentier economies. Totally agree. And yes, Sushmita's work also. Do you have any thoughts about the enthusiasm for extracting rents from property that seems to have spread across social classes? Also, we see new forms of finance circulating through small-scale properties, linking rental and land markets. This has implications for demands for clear property titles, regularization, etc. Absolutely. And, again, like as I was saying, a lot of the motivation for this paper came from zooming out from my work about slums and property to thinking about the city at large and how a sort of political economy of property in the city and a framing of property as the, as I say, the sort of dominant frame for thinking about time, space, and social relations in the city shapes lives for different social classes. And yes, there is this sort of growing turn to property and propertization in slums also, and emergence of rentier classes within slums also, for example, and this sort of optimism that property is a way out, that property is the answer, that actually getting this asset of property will be a way to a path to social and economic mobility in the absence of other paths, right? In the absence of other pathways. And I find that really interesting, and I find that there's a sort of cruel optimism about it, that that actually that's not going to work out. There are people gaining from the speculative urbanism turn that we see, as Carol and others have shown, but how that fits into the larger political economy of land in the city raises a lot of questions for me, and I do want to examine it further by thinking of ecology, by thinking about caste, by thinking about what is the progressive and future oriented politics of the city. At present, I find that if we look at administrators, if we look at planners, you don't really have a positive future oriented frame for thinking about the city. It's all reactive. So where do we look for alternatives to this? And I don't think property is that alternative, although we have to work with it, because as we've been discussing, it has kind of pervaded all different classes in the city. So I'm mindful of time. I see a couple more questions in the chat, and I see Pramod's hand. Swati, Yamini, what do you think?
Maybe Pramod can unmute himself and ask his question, and then maybe you can just summarize your responses to the couple of questions that we have in chat. Thanks, Indivar.
Thank you.
Hi, Indivar.
Hi, Pramod.
Hi, thanks for a talk. I have a couple of questions. One question is obviously about municipality. How does municipality, you are looked at an state as an other kind of a bureaucracy. I'm curious about how does municipality plays role in regulation, planning and policy with contradictory whatever thing. Second question is thanks to Eric, he brought it again and again about what about the Deccan, or is there something about princely state and something? So my question is there an impossibility to regulate the 1948, the kind of displacement? There are multiple ways of an land regulations. There are multiple kinds of lands, and also the political economy of land. So it's impossibility of an regulation. So it's easy to do it post facto rather than pre facto. Is there something like that with specific to the Hyderabad kind of thing? Because I came across a lot of such cases when I was in field. Thank you.
Thank you, Pramod. Yeah, so great observation about the municipality, which I didn't talk about. And, like that is the other big hub of governance and administration in the city. But one of the things that I'm trying to argue in this sort of piece is that property, while governed by these two departments that I give examples of in this talk, pervades the working of other departments as well. So, for example, when it comes to providing water supply or things like that, property becomes a meaningful frame for the municipal corporation. When it comes to widening roads or working on infrastructure, property is important, right? And so in that way, I was kind of centering these departments and thinking about the sort of the municipal corporation as one of those other sites of governance which are working with this fait accompli regulation. And on Deccan urbanism, yeah, I'm sorry I don't have like a satisfying, like crispy answer to how to think about this. And I do want to think more about it. But yeah, absolutely, Pramod, what you said is totally true. Like the fact that you have these divided and fragmentary property regimes means that doing the post facto doing regularization at all is really the most expedient way in a sense, and governments have often opted for that reason. But what I'm also connecting that to is that it's not just the story of the Deccan. I think it happens in the Deccan in peculiar ways, in particular ways. But that is also the story of Bombay. Mariam Dosal has shown how when the British, take Bombay from the Portuguese, the same kinds of things emerge for them. And I think even today you have, disputes and graynesses about various kinds of claims to land, because land is not just property. Land is not just a flat geometric shape on a map. It has gradient, it has products, it has various kinds of characteristics that are just not taken into consideration. And so that will always create sort of contradictions in the working of these departments. But I'll stop there and we can talk more about this also. And thanks for your question. I see Anand's hand. Maybe you can ask your question, sir.
Thanks, Indivar. And just a couple of questions. One is the issue of the state of the records and the technology that is associated with that. Now, there's a particular character to this that we are seeing in Telangana and Andhra, which has to do with the abolition of the hereditary record keeping system of the which happened in 1982, 83 kind of thing, 85, I think that's when it was stopped. It happened in other places at different points of time. But basically, there's that story. Then there is the story of the actual accession of Hyderabad to India, at which point of time land records should have been taken control of by the state. And it didn't happen. And there is an argument that can plausibly be made that the reason why the state didn't take command of the entire record, precisely to permit various kinds of social forces to have a play for themselves and figure out how to, sort it out through violence on the streets. So there's that whole story. So I was just wondering if there is something in your work which is looking at this change as an aspect of this technology. So that's one question. Because it'd be really interesting to see what this might lead to, where it might go, because this is not clearly a state of being. It is something that is constantly changing, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, because some of the categories, these categories that you're saying have been flattened out from the rural to the urban. That flattening is a temporal process as well, right? And it has a very distinct spatial pattern to it. And we're seeing it all the time. Right now we have a big battle going on with the cops and the revenue chaps on the ground threatening people at Kajagoda. There's a whole complicated stuff going on. But the second question that I had is the promise that you kind of threw out, which is about the question of ecology. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we have been constantly running into and haven't quite figured out how to tell the story through property is the relationship between sewage and property. Mm-hmm. Right? We've seen this in Golakpur. We see this all the time in the slums. We see it all the time in all the water bodies. There's a very distinct relationship between sewage and land as property in Hyderabad. And this is the case everywhere else, right? And that in the coming years is going to actually become the story of a malfunctioning urban metabolism. Mm. Right. And that story of a malfunctioning toxic urban metabolism that we don't know how to tell in the language of property, especially given the violence that is associated with that, right? Because essentially what happens is that you end up either telling it through the acts of violence, or we end up taking a very small part of the story and kind of escape into very abstract stories that look fine as theory. They hold together, but they are actually of not much use on the ground for us to do stuff with. So that's the promise and hope that I'm seeing, and I'm very optimistic that you will be able to put something together. But I really want to hear what you're thinking about that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'll start with the second question about ecology, because I think that's like, and thank you for the framing of sewage and property. I hadn't quite reached that yet, but as you know, like even my whole interest in property in the slums began because of a conflict over a community toilet. So it's always been sort of merged for me. But yeah, so this urban metabolism question, right? So that itself is another framing of the city, an alternative framing. But then how do we like if we think about land administration or city governance and how it might approach thinking about the city that way, what kinds of processes are needed, what kinds of policy innovations are needed to allow the city to think that way. And I feel like even when we think about environmental governance in the city, property is really central. So for example, the case of Malka Cheru, which until couple of years ago was a nuisance, and sort of this eyesore for these like real estate developments that wanted to come up around it. But then now with like Aparna's CSR funding, and like framing it as this like beautiful lake next to these new beautiful real estate developments, it becomes valorized again in the city. So there's a way in which property mediates what is framed as either nuisance or nature in the city. And I think there's something interesting happening between that nuisance and nature binary, or I'm kind of posing it as a dichotomy. And this is something I think that will, even by the force of nature, become an urgent need in the coming future, right? Like to actually grapple with the metabolism of the city, as you're saying, as the city contends with changing climates, more expansion and growth, and like more hills have been destroyed. We have to see how that ends up affecting the city. And then when it comes to the state of records, yes, absolutely, there is this, again, like a particular history to the state of records in Hyderabad, which is mind-boggling in a sense of how anything happens. But I also think it's interesting that and this relates also to a question in the chat about like are there conversations about